Right now, major financial institutions are quietly running the math on $150 a barrel oil.
Which is, I mean, that's a terrifying number.
It really is, and it is not a typo. So it's Sunday, April 5, 2026, and in just the last 48 hours, this geopolitical powder keg between the United States and Iran has pushed the global economy to, well, the absolute edge of a cliff.
Yeah, we are looking at disrupted oil flows in the Strait of Hormuz. We're seeing some intense military posturing, and this is we are watching real-time fractures within NATO.
Right. And if you're wondering how a conflict thousands of miles away is about to violently disrupt your grocery budget or, your mortgage rate or your retirement portfolio, you are in the right place. Welcome to today's deep dive.
It's just a really critical moment to take a step back from the minute-by-minute alert cycle,
Oh, absolutely.
because the sheer volume of information flying across the wires right now is staggering. And honestly, a lot of it is deliberately obfuscated by the actors involved.
Which is exactly why we are here. Our mission today is to cut through that noise for you. We are unpacking a massive dossier of intelligence and analysis headlined by a comprehensive report titled The High Cost of Conflict, Iran, and the Oil Squeeze.
Plus, we've got a stack of up-to-the-minute wire reports from Reuters, the Associated Press, and The Guardian.
Right. Now, before we get into the actual mechanics of this crisis, we really need to set the parameters for how we are analyzing this today.
Yeah, that's important.
Because these reports deal with highly polarizing figures and entities, right? Like the Mangier movement, Donald Trump, the Iranian government. So we are leaving our own politics entirely at the door today.
Completely.
We are not here to endorse any domestic or international political viewpoint. We are strictly here to act as your data translators, just mapping out the geopolitical chessboard, the historical timelines, and the economic data exactly as the intelligence presents it without taking a side.
And honestly, that's the only way to accurately forecast the risk. You have to look at the board objectively. And to understand the board as it sits today, we have to recognize that this crisis is operating on three distinct levels.
Okay, lay those out for us.
So first, there is the historical gravity, that deep structural paranoia that dictates how Washington and Tehran actually perceive each other.
Right.
Second, there's the immediate, real-time diplomatic and military friction. Basically, the massive gap between what political leaders are saying on television and the actual tactical movements happening on the ground.
Which we'll get into because that gap is huge right now.
Oh, it's massive. And finally, there's the localized economic fallout, the precise mechanisms by which a naval standoff in the Middle East triggers a secondary wave of inflation that lands right on your kitchen table.
So let's start with that first level. Let's really unpack the historical gravity, because whenever I read the rhetoric right now from both the U.S. and Iranian leadership, it never feels like a localized dispute over a single shipping lane.
No, not at all.
It feels incredibly visceral. It feels like every single diplomatic cable or military maneuver is carrying like 100 pounds of historical baggage. Why does every confrontation with Iran immediately feel so existential?
Well, because it's sitting on a profoundly compressed foundation of mutual trauma and, perceived betrayal.
Okay.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you simply cannot view the U.S.-Iran dynamic as a standard diplomatic rivalry. I mean, this isn't France and the U.K. arguing over fishing rights.
Right.
Neither nation views the other as a conventional adversary. To understand the psychology driving the decisions in Tehran right now, the intelligence reports explicitly require us to look at the foundational architecture of the modern Iranian political identity.
Which starts when, exactly?
It really solidifies in 1953.
Okay, wait, 1953, that is over 70 years ago? We're talking about the Eisenhower administration here. Why is an intelligence report about a 2026 oil crisis dedicating space to the early Cold War?
Because 1953 is the absolute bedrock of Tehran's institutional paranoia regarding the West.
Wow. Okay, so what happened?
Well, that year, Iran had a democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and Mossadegh made a highly consequential economic decision. He moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had, up until that point, been largely controlled by British interests through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is what we now know as BP.
So she decides that Iranian resources should belong to the Iranian state.
Right.
And in the context of the 1950s, that is a direct threat to Western energy hegemony.
A massive threat. So in response, British intelligence, working directly with the CIA under an operation codenamed Operation Ajax, orchestrated a covert coup.
A literal coup?
Yeah. And they didn't just assassinate a leader. They systematically dismantled the democratic apparatus.
Jeez.
They funded opposition groups, they manufactured street protests, they bribed military officers, and they successfully removed Mossadegh from power.
And who did they put in his place?
They restored the monarch, the Shah, who essentially operated as a heavily armed pro-Western autocrat.
So if we look at the mechanics of that from the Iranian perspective, the core narrative of their modern history becomes like, we attempted democracy, we attempted sovereignty over our own natural resources, and the United States covertly engineered a collapse of our society just to install a compliant dictator who would keep the oil flowing.
That is the exact narrative.
Yeah.
And it is burned into the institutional memory of the Iranian state.
I can imagine.
It created this deep-seated doctrine that the United States cannot be trusted in any diplomatic capacity, because America's ultimate goal is always regime change and resource extraction.
Right, so that sets the stage.
Exactly. And that sentiment simmered under the surface for 26 years during the Shah's rule.
Because he was keeping a tight lid on things, right?
Very tight. The Shah modernized the country economically, but his internal security apparatus, the SAVAK, was incredibly repressive. And that pressure cooker finally detonates in the next major milestone the sources highlight, which is 1979.
1979. The Iranian Revolution. So that's the overthrow of the Shah, the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini, and the establishment of the Islamic Republic.
Yes.
But, while 1953 is the trauma that defines Iran's view of America, the immediate aftermath of 1979 kind of creates the foundational trauma for the American side.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm talking about the hostage crisis.
Yeah, the hostage crisis is the moment the American psyche regarding Iran is fundamentally permanently altered.
Right.
In November 1979, Iranian students overran the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage.
And they held them for a long time.
444 days.
454 days. And we have to remember the context of media at that time. Like, this wasn't just a footnote in a newspaper.
No, not right.
This was the birth of modern 247 crisis television. Networks were running nightly countdowns, day 100, day 200 of the hostage crisis.
Nightline literally started because of this.
Yeah. Exactly. The American public was watching footage of their citizens being blindfolded and paraded in front of cameras. It was a daily, visceral humiliation of a global superpower.
And it paralyzed the Carter administration.
Mm-hmm.
It resulted in a disastrously failed rescue mission called Operation Eagle Claw, where U.S. service members actually died in the desert.
Just a total disaster.
Total disaster.
Okay.
And completely severed diplomatic ties in 1980. The U.S. State Department has had zero on-the-ground presence in Iran from that moment forward.
No.
But the timeline of grievance doesn't stop there. The sources point out that the 1980s forged the specific military doctrine we are seeing Iran use today.
Okay, so you're talking about the Iran-Iraq War.
Precisely.
Yeah.
In 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. That kicked off an incredibly brutal 8-year trench war that looked more like World War I than modern combat.
Right, because they were using chemical weapons, right?
Chemical weapons, human wave attacks that cost hundreds of thousands of Iranian lives. And during that war, the United States, prioritizing the containment of the new Islamic Republic, provided crucial backing to Iraq.
Wow. So we backed Saddam.
Yes. The U.S. provided economic aid, dual-use technology, and vital satellite intelligence that allowed the Iraqi military to target Iranian positions.
So Iran is fighting for its survival, taking catastrophic casualties, and they are watching the United States actively assist the dictator, dropping chemical weapons on their troops.
Yes.
How does that shape their military strategy moving forward? Because they obviously realize they cannot go toe-to-toe with Western-backed conventional armies.
That realization right there is the genesis of Iran's entire modern military posture.
Really?
Yeah. The intelligence sources highlight that the Iran-Iraq War taught Tehran a brutal mathematical lesson. They cannot win a conventional symmetric war.
Because they don't have the gear.
Right. They don't have the Air Force. They don't have the armor. So they designed a doctrine of asymmetric proxy warfare.
Asymmetric proxy warfare.
Exactly. They built the Quds Force, which is an elite branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, designed entirely for unconventional warfare and intelligence operations. And instead of building massive tank battalions, they spent the next 40 years funding, training, and arming regional militias. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various paramilitaries in Iraq and Syria.
So they essentially built a decentralized ring of fire.
That's a good way to put it.
Just a network of proxy armies that allows them to project power and harass adversaries across the Middle East without ever engaging in a direct, state-on-state conventional war.
Exactly. And that brings us right into the modern era of the conflict.
Okay.
In the early 2000s, the Bush administration designates Iran as part of the axis of evil. Then we enter the era of the nuclear dispute. As Iran's nuclear program advances, the U.S. and its allies construct the most sophisticated, crippling economic sanctions regime in modern history.
Let's talk about the mechanics of those sanctions for a second, because people hear the word sanctions and they think of like tariffs or trade disputes.
Right, just attacks.
Yeah. But what was done to Iran was closer to financial strangulation, wasn't it?
Oh, it was a total economic blockade.
Yeah.
The U.S. didn't just ban American companies from doing business with Iran. They weaponized the entire global financial system.
How so?
They utilized secondary sanctions, meaning they told the rest of the world, you can do business with Iran or you can do business with the United States. You cannot do both.
And obviously, everyone chooses the U.S.
Of course. They successfully pressured SWIFT, which is the messaging network that underpins global banking, to disconnect Iranian banks.
Wow.
So Iran was essentially locked out of the global economy. They couldn't sell their oil on the open market. They couldn't repatriate foreign currency reserves. It decimated their currency and caused massive internal inflation.
Which eventually forces them to the negotiating table, right?
Culminating in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which is commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal.
Yes. The 2015 deal was a highly technical, highly specific arms control agreement. In exchange for the lifting of those crippling economic sanctions, Iran agreed to dismantle vast portions of its nuclear infrastructure.
So they actually gave stuff up. They did. They shipped out 97% of their enriched uranium, they poured concrete into the core of their heavy water reactor, and they submitted to the most intrusive, round-the-clock inspection regime ever implemented by the International Atomic Energy Agency.
And for a minute there, it seems like an actual diplomatic breakthrough. I mean, international observers, the IAEA, European allies, they all confirmed Iran was complying with the technical parameters of the deal.
They did. But the sources emphasize the recent ruptures that have poured absolute gasoline on the prices we are looking at in 2026.
Right.
In 2018, the United States, under the Trump administration, unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA.
They just walked away.
Walked away, reinstated all the sanctions, and introduced a policy of maximum pressure.
If we look at that from the Iranian perspective, going back to the psychology we talked about earlier, that withdrawal validates every paranoid instinct they developed since 1953.
100%.
Like, we made a deal with the Americans, we gave up our leverage, we allowed inspectors into our facilities, and the Americans tore up the paper anyway.
It completely vindicated the hardliners in Tehran, who always argued that negotiating with the West was a trap.
Right.
And then the final, most explosive piece of recent history occurs in January 2020.
The drone strike.
Yes. The U.S. drone strike outside the Baghdad airport that assassinated Qasem Soleimani.
The commander of the Quds Force, the architect of that entire asymmetric proxy network we just discussed.
Killing Soleimani was a paradigm shift. It wasn't just killing a general, it was killing a figure who held near-mythic status within the Iranian establishment.
Yeah.
It demonstrated that the U.S. was willing to execute a direct, kinetic strike on a senior state official, which completely shattered the unwritten rules of engagement that had governed the shadow war for decades.
So when we look at the board today, it isn't just a feud. I think analogies often fail us here, but let's try to frame it. Don't think of this as two countries arguing over a treaty.
No.
Think of this as a 70-year ledger of leverage, paranoia, and trauma. Every maneuver in the Strait of Hormuz today isn't just a tactical decision. It is a response to the CIA in 1953, the hostages in 1979, the chemical weapons in the 1980s, the sanctions in the 2010s, and the assassination in 2020.
The analytical takeaway here is that when you have a relationship defined by zero trust and a massive ledger of historical grievances, the standard mechanisms of diplomacy simply do not function.
They break down.
Completely. It is why a single spark, like a harassed oil tanker or a drone flying too close to airspace, can ignite a regional war.
Right.
Neither side believes the other is capable of acting in good faith, and neither side believes they can afford to back down, because backing down triggers the institutional trauma of past humiliations.
Which brings us directly to the collision course we are seeing on the ground right now. Because the historical momentum is pushing heavily toward conflict, But the intelligence reports highlight a fascinating, incredibly dangerous contradiction in the current American political landscape.
Yeah, we really need to examine the friction between the stated ideological goals of the current U.S. administration and the tactical reality of what is actually happening in the Middle East right now.
Yes.
The sources dedicate significant analysis to the paradox of the Magie movement's foreign policy.
Right. Because if we look at the core platform of the America First movement over the last decade, it has fundamentally sold itself to the electorate as the anti-forever war coalition.
Exactly.
The rhetoric has been overwhelmingly skeptical of global entanglements. It has fiercely criticized the policing of the world. It has questioned the utility of NATO. And it has consistently promised to bring troops home and keep America out of foreign quagmires.
The entire brand is domestic restraint.
Exactly. But when we read the wire reports from AP and Reuters from April 5, 2026, the force posture looks completely different.
The force posture is the exact opposite of restraint. The intelligence outlines how the current aggressive military maneuvering against Iran is inextricably tying U.S. military power to a highly volatile, escalating regional conflict.
And we have to look at the mechanics of this risk, right? This isn't just a theoretical standoff.
Not at all. The United States maintains a massive archipelago of military bases across the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, in the Gulf states.
And as tensions rise, every single one of those bases, housing thousands of American troops, basically becomes a static target for Iran's network of proxy militias.
Precisely. But the risk goes far beyond static bases.
Okay.
The sources point out the immense mathematical probability of escalation once you increase naval and aerial patrols in contested spaces like the Persian Gulf.
With putting more planes in the air.
Yeah, when you have carrier strike groups projecting power, launching sorties, and engaging in aggressive brinkmanship with Iranian fast attack craft, the odds of a catastrophic miscalculation skyrocket.
Let's walk through a hypothetical scenario the reports touch on. What happens if a U.S. pilot goes down?
Right, so if an American F-18 experiences a mechanical failure or, is hit by a surface-to-air missile and a pilot ejects over hostile or contested territory, the entire geopolitical equation changes in minutes.
We have to get them back.
The U.S. military operates on a sacred imperative to never leave a service member behind. They will immediately launch a combat search and rescue or CRSAR mission.
And executing a CSAR mission inside an integrated air defense network isn't just like sending a helicopter.
Oh, not at all. It requires a massive package of assets. You need electronic warfare planes to jam radars. You need fighter escorts to establish air superiority. You need suppression of enemy air defense sea admissions to actively bomb anti-aircraft batteries. Suddenly, a single downed pilot dictates a massive preemptive bombing campaign against Iranian infrastructure just to clear a corridor for a rescue helicopter.
So a technical malfunction turns into a massive kinetic escalation before anyone in Washington or Tehran even has time to schedule a phone call. But hold on, if the U.S. is projecting this much unilateral force, surely they are coordinating with the broader Western alliance. Like, if you are risking a regional war, you need your logistical hubs and your coalition partners fully locked in.
And that is where the paradox becomes a full-blown diplomatic crisis.
Okay.
The wire reports highlight a severe real-time rupture within NATO. The push for this massive unilateral projection of dominance is actively fracturing the alliances the U.S. relies on for global logistics.
Give me an example.
The most glaring example in the current reporting is Spain.
Right. The AP report notes that Spain has officially closed its airspace to U.S. military planes involved in the Middle East conflict.
Yeah.
And let's really pause and examine the gravity of that. Spain is not a neutral, non-aligned nation. Spain is a major foundational NATO ally.
And crucially, Spain is a vital logistical bridge.
Yeah.
The U.S. relies heavily on facilities like Naval Station Rota and Meron Air Base in southern Spain to move troops, cargo, and heavy bombers from the continental United States into the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
So when Spain closes its airspace to these specific operations, they're essentially throwing sand into the gears of the American military logistical machine.
They are. It forces U.S. aircraft to fly longer routes, requiring more mid-air refueling, burning more fuel, and increasing the operational friction of every single mission.
Why is Spain taking such a drastic step against an ally?
Because European capitals are looking at the tactical reality, and they are terrified.
They don't want a part of it.
No, they are looking at the potential economic fallout, which we will detail shortly, and they are signaling that they refuse to facilitate a unilateral American escalation that they believe is entirely avoidable.
Wow.
The intelligence analysis concludes that, to global observers, the current U.S. strategy looks less like America First restraint and much more like a chaotic return to the heavy unilateral interventionism of the early 2000s.
Yeah.
But this time, without the diplomatic coalition to support it.
It's an incredible contradiction. I mean, you cannot claim to be ending foreign entanglements while simultaneously alienating your core NATO allies because you are driving headfirst into a new, massive war in the Middle East.
Right.
And the friction isn't just happening in the airspace over Spain. It is happening on the airwaves.
The messaging war.
Yeah.
The battle for the narrative.
Yes. For anyone listening right now who is a student of strategic communication, or frankly, just a student of human psychology, what we are witnessing is a masterclass in contrasting diplomatic messaging.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources lay out how both the U.S. and Iran are fighting a completely separate, highly sophisticated war for public perception, and the tactics are wildly divergent.
Let's analyze the American side of the microphone first.
Okay.
The intelligence heavily documents what analysts describe as rapid, highly erratic shifts in U.S. strategic messaging.
Erratic.
The tactic appears to be intentional unpredictability, but the result is strategic ambiguity. For instance, Reuters reports that on one hand, Donald Trump is threatening massive, devastating kinetic escalation.
Right. He's issuing explicit threats to target critical civilian and economic infrastructure inside Iran, specifically mentioning power plants and bridges, if the Strait of Hormuz is not immediately reopened.
Threatening to hit power plants and bridges. I mean, that isn't targeting a military base. That is threatening to cripple the electrical grid of a nation of over 80 million people.
Yes.
That is maximum pressure, apocalyptic rhetoric.
It is the absolute extreme edge of deterrence. But then, almost in the same news cycle, within hours, the messaging wildly pivots.
Right.
The same reports note that Trump is simultaneously floating the idea to the press that a comprehensive, overarching deal with Iran could be reached by Monday.
By Monday, you cannot go from, I will bomb your power grid into the Stone Age, to let's sign a historic peace treaty over the weekend without inducing global diplomatic whiplash.
And that whiplash is exactly what European allies are reacting to.
The Guardian reports that French President Emmanuel Macron has publicly, sharply criticized these mixed messages. And if we look at the mechanics of deterrence, this erraticism is incredibly dangerous.
Because they don't know what we want.
Exactly. Deterrence only works when your adversary understands exactly where your red lines are and what the precise consequences of crossing those lines will be.
That makes sense.
When the leader of a superpower shifts violently between threatening literal hellfire and proposing a casual transactional deal, it destroys credibility. Iran cannot gauge what will actually trigger a U.S. military response, which increases the likelihood that they will push the boundary too far.
Which opens a massive psychological door for Tehran.
Yes, it does.
The intelligence reports touch on this, and it's a highly delicate analytical point, but we have to address it. Why are some geopolitical observers and even segments of the Western public reacting as if Iran's messaging is somehow more coherent than the United States right now?
We must heavily caveat this, exactly as the source material does.
Right.
This is entirely an analysis of perception, not reality. The intelligence is explicit. The Iranian state apparatus is highly sophisticated at propaganda, omission, and psychological manipulation.
Okay, let's be very clear about that.
Tehran is not operating as a beacon of objective truth.
Right. They are a state actor locked in an existential conflict. Their messaging is designed to achieve their tactical goals, full stop.
Absolutely. However, Iran's intelligence services are strategically exploiting a massive pre-existing U.S. credibility gap.
The credibility gap.
Yeah. And to understand the mechanics of that gap, we have to look at the domestic American audience. The U.S. government has suffered a catastrophic decline in official credibility over the last 25 years.
I mean, that's undeniable.
You have the legacy of the Iraq War and the completely fabricated weapons of mass destruction narratives.
Mm-hmm.
You have the 20-year narrative of progress in Afghanistan that ended in a chaotic withdrawal.
Right.
Add to that the intense, daily, hyper-partisan misinformation ecosystem within modern U.S. politics. The reality is that a significant portion of the American public simply does not trust official U.S. national security narratives anymore, regardless of which party controls the White House.
It's like the boy who cried wolf syndrome, but playing out on a geopolitical scale with nuclear implications.
Precisely. And Iran's strategic communications teams understand this vulnerability perfectly.
So what are they doing?
The sources point to a highly specific tactical psychological operation recently launched by Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. He published an open letter.
An open letter?
Yes, but he didn't direct it to the White House or to the State Department or to the United Nations. He directed it straight to the American people.
Wow.
In the letter, he claims that the Iranian government has absolutely no hostility toward ordinary American citizens and frames Iran as a rational actor simply trying to defend its sovereignty against unprovoked imperial aggression.
But hold on, let me push back on that. Are the American people actually buying that? Given the decades of absolute visceral distrust we just spent 20 minutes outlining, isn't an open letter from the Iranian president just shouting into the void? Like, who is the actual target audience for that?
It is a brilliant question. The goal of the letter isn't to make the American public suddenly love the Iranian government.
Okay.
The goal is to lower the political capital required for U.S. intervention. They are targeting the exhaustion. They are aiming directly at American war fatigue and inflation anxiety. By speaking calmly and consistently, and by framing themselves as reluctant participants in a conflict forced upon them, they are attempting to paralyze the political will in Washington.
They just want us to stay out of it.
They want the average American voter to look at the situation and say, I don't trust our own government's narrative. The other side is at least sounding somewhat rational, and I definitely don't want to pay double for gas to fight a war I don't understand.
It is weaponized coherence.
Yes, because consistency, even when it is carefully crafted wartime propaganda coming from an adversary, can sound an awful lot like sanity when the other side is rapidly bouncing between, we will destroy your civilian infrastructure and we'll have a deal by Monday.
Yeah, the contrast is stark.
If one side sounds completely erratic, the side that just stays quietly consistent on their talking points suddenly appears, to certain audiences, as the adult in the room. It is a calculated move to isolate the U.S. administration from its own electorate.
So we have mapped the macro picture. We have a 70-year history of mutual betrayal that makes standard diplomacy impossible. We have a contradictory U.S. military posture that is actively fracturing NATO logistics. And we have a psychological messaging war where the adversary is surgically exploiting American exhaustion.
Right.
But let's pull this out of the abstract world of diplomatic chess. Let's bring it right into the kitchen of the person listening to us right now.
This is crucial.
Because psychological operations in closed airspace matter, absolutely, but disrupted global shipping lanes matter immediately, tangibly to your wallet.
Yes. This is where the geopolitical crisis translates directly into a localized economic shock. The intelligence material pivots hard into the reality of the April 2026 oil squeeze. And it all revolves around the mechanics of one specific, highly vulnerable geographic choke point.
Which is?
The Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz. We hear this phrase constantly on the news, but let's actually define the geography and the mechanics of why it is so critical. It is a waterway located between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, right?
Yes.
And it is the only sea passage connecting the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the open ocean and the global market.
And its geography is its vulnerability. At its narrowest point, the strait is only 21 miles wide.
Which isn't very wide.
Not at all, but the actual shipping lanes, the deepwater channels that massive supertankers require to safely navigate, are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
2 miles? That's tiny.
It is a needle's eye.
Yeah.
And roughly 20% of the world's total global oil consumption passes through that 2-mile-wide channel every single day.
So when the sources report that the current conflict has disrupted a meaningful share of global supply there, we aren't just talking about a minor delay. We are talking about the potential weaponization of the world's energy supply.
Absolutely.
How exactly does the disruption happen? I mean, it's not like you can just build a brick wall across the ocean.
You don't need a wall. You just need risk.
Risk.
Yeah, Iran doesn't necessarily need to sink a dozen tankers to close the strait. They can utilize their isometric naval capabilities, swarms of fast attack craft, anti-ship cruise missiles hidden along the rugged coastline, and most importantly, naval mines.
Oh, wow.
The mere threat of naval mines being deployed in a 2-mile-wide shipping lane causes maritime insurance premiums to absolutely skyrocket.
Because no one wants to lose a ship.
Exactly. Within days, the major global shipping companies and insurance syndicates in London will simply refuse to allow their vessels to enter the Gulf. The ship stops sailing, the oil stops flowing, and the market instantly prices in a massive supply shock.
Okay, but I have to push back here because this is the single most common question people have, and it is something politicians use constantly in domestic messaging.
What's your...
The United States produces a massive amount of its own oil. We have the Permian Basin in Texas, we have the Bakken Formation, we have the shale revolution. We are a dominant energy producer.
Where you are?
So if we pump our own oil, why does a disruption in a 2-mile wide waterway on the other side of the planet mean I pay more for gas in Ohio or Florida or Texas?
It is a critical misunderstanding of how the energy economy functions. The intelligence reports clarify this perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
The United States does not and cannot live in a sealed-off energy bubble.
We're not isolated.
No. We have to stop using the swimming pool analogy where we think we have our own pool of oil. Think of the global oil market like an interconnected global power grid.
A power grid. Okay, explain the mechanics of that.
If a massive power plant goes offline in one part of a grid, the entire system experiences a drop in voltage, and the price of electricity spikes across the entire network as demand suddenly outstrips the remaining supply.
Right.
Oil is a globally traded fungible commodity.
Mm.
If 20% of the world's oil is suddenly trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz, buyers in Asia, in Europe, in India, who relied on that Middle Eastern oil, panic.
Because they still need the oil.
They still need energy to run their economies.
Yeah.
So they turn to the open market and they start aggressively outbidding each other for the oil being produced everywhere else.
Including the U.S.
Including the oil being produced in Texas.
So American oil producers aren't just going to sell their oil to American consumers at a discount out of the goodness of their heart.
Exactly. They are businesses.
Right. If a buyer in Tokyo is willing to pay double for a barrel of Texan crude because they are desperate, the American refinery has to pay that same doubled price just to keep the oil from being exported.
Exactly. You are not necessarily paying for imported oil at the pump. You are paying the global panic premium required to keep American oil inside America.
That makes total sense.
And the scale of this potential premium in 2026 is terrifying. The sources cite a highly detailed forecast from J.P. Morgan, which runs complex predictive algorithms on supply shocks.
What do the models say?
Their models indicate that if these disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz persist into mid-May, the compounding risk premium could push global crude prices over $150 a barrel.
$150 a barrel. That is catastrophic demand destruction territory.
It is.
But let's bring that abstract number down to the micro level. Let's walk through the exact mechanisms of the ripple effect. Because if crude hits $150, the pain goes vastly beyond the number flashing on the sign at your local gas station.
Oh, the gas pump is merely the leading edge of the storm.
Right.
The primary shock wave hits the foundation of global logistics, transportation. And when crude oil spikes, the refined product that reacts the most violently is diesel.
And diesel is the absolute lifeblood of the physical economy.
It is the invisible engine of everything. Diesel powers the massive container ships crossing the Pacific. It powers the freight trains crawling across the Midwest. And crucially, it powers the millions of 18-wheelers that move literally every single physical product we consume.
Everything moves on diesel.
Everything. To understand the inflation mechanism, we have to look at something called freight ton miles. If the cost to move a ton of freight 1 mile doubles because diesel prices have exploded, that increased cost is instantly embedded into the supply chain.
Let's trace it. Let's trace something incredibly basic like a box of cereal.
Okay, good example. The grain for the cereal is harvested by combine tractors running on diesel. It is transported to a processing facility by a truck running on diesel. The packaging materials, the cardboard and the plastic liner, are derived from petroleum products and transported via diesel freight. Finally, an 18-wheeler hauls that finished box of cereal from a distribution center to your local grocery store. The trucking company cannot absorb a 100% increase in their fuel costs.
So they raise their rates.
They raise their freight rates. The distributor raises their wholesale prices.
And the grocery store operates on razor-thin margins, usually around 1 or 2%. They cannot absorb it either.
No.
So the final link in the chain is you. The grocery store changes the price tag. When you buy that box of cereal, you are quietly, invisibly paying the geopolitical tax of the Strait of Hormuz.
Exactly. It creates a massive secondary wave of inflation. And the intelligence knows that Europe is already experiencing the leading edge of this right now.
Really?
Yeah, their baseline energy costs are feeding into systemic price pressure across all sectors. And when energy costs drive up the baseline cost of living, central banks are forced into a terrifying trap.
The stagflation trap. Explain how a central bank like the Federal Reserve in the U.S. reacts to this kind of supply-side inflation.
So the Federal Reserve's primary tool to fight inflation is raising interest rates. Usually, they raise rates to cool down an overheating economy where people are spending too much money.
Right, trying to slow things down.
But an energy shock is different. An energy shock causes inflation while simultaneously slowing the economy down because consumers have less money to spend on other things.
Because they're spending it all on gas and food.
Exactly. If the Fed sees inflation spiking because of $150 oil, they are forced to keep interest rates stubbornly high or even hike them further to prevent inflation expectations from becoming entrenched.
Which means the consumer gets hit with a double-edged sword. You're paying vastly more for your groceries and your fuel to get to work, and simultaneously, your credit card interest rates stay at punishing highs.
Yes.
Auto loans become unaffordable, and mortgage rates remain elevated, locking people out of the housing market. The geopolitical shock hits you at the pump, at the checkout counter, and at the bank.
It's a squeeze on all fronts.
Which sounds incredibly bleak. I mean, it feels entirely paralyzing. You're describing a macroeconomic tsunami. But this is the pivot point of the deep dive. We always want to empower the listener.
Of course.
Because we cannot control the Strait of Hormuz, we cannot dictate the erratic diplomatic rhetoric, and we certainly can't change the historical grievances of 1953.
Yep.
So what does this actually mean for the individual listening right now, and what are the specific mechanical steps they can take to defend their household balance sheet?
Well, the intelligence and financial analysis provide a clear framework for defensive posturing. These are practical, judgment-based strategies designed specifically to mitigate the risk of a massive, sudden energy shock.
Okay, let's hear them.
They're built on understanding how inflation waves actually move through an economy.
Let's break down the defense strategies. Step 1 focuses on liquidity. The recommendation is to aggressively build and hold larger cash reserves for the next 3 to 4 months.
Right.
Why is cash suddenly king in an inflationary spike? Doesn't inflation devalue cash?
Over a long term, yes. But in the short term of a crisis, you are guarding against the lag effect.
The lag effect.
Yes. When crude oil spikes to $150 on a Monday, gasoline prices go up by Wednesday. But the price of that box of cereal we talked about might not go up for 3 to 4 weeks because the grocery store is still selling through the inventory they bought at the older, cheaper freight rate.
Ah, so the secondary wave of inflation is delayed.
Exactly. The energy shock takes time to fully permeate the consumer goods sector. By building a cash buffer now, before the cost of your basic living expenses spikes by 20%, you ensure you have the liquidity to absorb the hit.
That makes total sense.
The ultimate goal is to avoid being forced to use high-interest credit cards just to buy groceries when the lag effect finally catches up to your household budget.
Like building the levee before the floodwaters arrive.
Perfect analogy.
Step 2 deals with discretionary spending, specifically travel. The advice is to immediately delay or cancel discretionary travel that relies heavily on airfare or long-distance driving.
Right, this is about avoiding the most volatile price sectors. The aviation industry runs on jet fuel, which is highly refined kerosene. It's incredibly sensitive to crude oil prices.
And airlines try to prep for that, don't they?
They attempt to hedge their fuel costs by buying futures contracts. But during a massive, unpredictable geopolitical shock, those hedges often fail to cover the extreme spread.
And when the airlines face a massive shortfall, they pass that cost directly to the consumer in the form of fuel surcharges.
Instantly. If you are planning a massive cross-country road trip or an international flight that is purely discretionary, the financial data strongly suggest waiting out this period of extreme volatility. You will be paying a massive geopolitical premium for the privilege of moving anywhere right now.
Okay, step 3 is critical: debt management. The analysts are explicitly warning against taking on any new variable rate debt.
This ties directly back to the Federal Reserve trap we discussed. Variable rate debt, like certain credit cards, adjustable rate mortgages, or home equity lines of credit, fluctuate based on the prime rate. If $150 oil triggers a massive secondary wave of inflation, the Fed will be forced to keep rates high or hike them further to crush demand.
So what happens to the debt?
If you take out variable debt right now thinking rates have peaked, you're exposing your household to immense risk. Your monthly payments could suddenly skyrocket in 3 months based entirely on decisions made in a central bank boardroom.
Wow.
If you absolutely must borrow, lock in fixed rates. But avoiding new debt entirely is the only safe play.
Step 4 is arguably the most important for long-term financial health, especially for older listeners watching their screens right now: retirement and investments.
This is a big one.
The absolute critical warning here is do not panic sell your long-term investments due to geopolitical volatility.
The term analysts use is emotional liquidation, and it destroys wealth faster than the actual crisis.
Emotional liquidation.
Yeah. When a massive international conflict erupts, algorithmic trading systems and institutional investors panic. The stock market reacts with violent, sudden downward gaps. It is deeply terrifying to open your 401k and see a 15% drop in a week.
I mean, human nature makes you want to pull it all out, but the historical data tells a very specific story about how markets digest geopolitical shocks.
It does. Look at the historical mechanisms of the 1990 Gulf War or the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Markets price in the absolute worst-case scenario instantly. That causes the crash.
Right.
But energy shocks hit fast, and then the global system aggressively adapts. Supply chains reroute, strategic petroleum reserves are released, alternative energy sources are brought online.
This system finds a way.
Exactly. As the reality is managed, the market algorithms adjust, and the indices typically rebound. If you succumb to panic and sell your mutual funds during that initial terrifying dip, all you've done is permanently locked in your losses.
Because you missed the rebound.
Yes. You have taken the temporary paper volatility and turned it into realized, permanent financial destruction. Unless you require that exact cash to survive tomorrow, the historical data universally dictates riding out the turbulence. Leave the portfolio alone.
Okay, step 5, budget stress testing. When you are looking at your household budget for the next quarter, the advice is to assume intense, immediate volatility in non-discretionary categories, specifically fuel and food.
You need to perform a stress test on your own life, similar to how a bank stress tests a portfolio. Sit down and calculate your absolute mandatory expenses.
Okay.
If your weekly commute costs double because of gas prices and your grocery bill increases by 20% because of diesel freight costs, what is the exact dollar amount of that shortfall?
You have to find that money somewhere.
Exactly. And you need to identify where it comes from before the crisis hits. Identify the discretionary spend, the streaming subscriptions, the dining out, the delayed upgrades that you can instantly pause.
Having a plan.
Yes. Having that specific mathematical plan in place prevents the emotional panic when the reality of the price shock hits your bank account.
So let's pull all this vast information together. Let's synthesize the true scale of what we have unpacked today. We started by examining the deep mechanics of 70 years of traumatic history between the U.S. and Iran.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We went through the intelligence operations of 1953, the psychological scars of 1979, the asymmetric warfare doctrine forged in the 1980s, and the broken nuclear treaties.
Right.
We looked at a current American political landscape caught in a paradox, betraying its own America First promises of restraint by projecting massive unilateral force, risking thousands of troops, and actively fracturing the logistical backbone of NATO allies like Spain.
And the messaging war.
Yes, we examined a highly sophisticated psychological messaging war where Iran is surgically exploiting American war fatigue while U.S. leadership shatters deterrence with erratic mixed signals. And finally, we traced the exact economic mechanisms of how a naval mine in a 2-mile-wide strait triggers a global panic premium, drives up diesel freight costs, traps the Federal Reserve into maintaining high interest rates, and ultimately raises the price of your groceries and threatens your retirement.
When you look at the totality of that analysis, the overarching theme that the intelligence insists upon becomes incredibly clear. A conflict with Iran is not broadly beneficial for the United States, nor for the global economy.
It is a lose-lose proposition on a macroeconomic scale.
It really is. It might temporarily enrich a very narrow, specific set of actors. Certain domestic oil producers might see record short-term profits. Select defense and aerospace firms might see their stock valuations rise on the expectation of replenished munitions.
Sure.
And political figures who thrive on nationalist mobilization might gain a fleeting polling bump. But for the broad American public, it simply means a drastically higher cost of living, massive financial market stress, and a dangerous, potentially generational global rupture.
And that brings us to the core realization of this entire deep dive. When the historical foundations are this complex and the economic systems are this tightly wound, there are no clean breaks. There are no isolated incidents.
Which leaves us with a lingering, frankly provocative thought to mull over as we watch this crisis unfold over the coming weeks.
Let's hear it.
We have spent an hour detailing how decades of deeply ingrained paranoia make standard good faith diplomacy nearly impossible. And we have just traced the exact mathematical pathways of how a single geographic choke point, thousands of miles away, can entirely derail the global economy and dictate the inflation rate in your hometown.
Yeah.
It raises a profound question about the nature of modern power. In a deeply interconnected, algorithmically traded world where a naval standoff in the Persian Gulf instantly dictates the price of a tomato in Texas, is the very idea of a localized or contained military conflict purely an illusion.
Wow. Are we past the point in human history where a superpower can actually project force without simultaneously attacking its own economy?
The economic data strongly suggests we might be. And if we accept that reality, we know that aggressive unilateral military posturing only yields incredibly expensive, uncontrollable economic blowback for the average citizen. What would a genuinely new, effective doctrine of foreign deterrence even look like?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. Because the current playbook, relying on the threat of overwhelming force, seems to be financially crippling the very people it claims to protect.
That is the exact question we all need to be asking as we watch the screens and the gas pumps this week. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and seriously, go stress test those household budgets. We will see you next time.